All right, everyone, good to see you. We are now going to finish up our look at material that is covered in both Chapter 23 and Chapter 24 with an examination of the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. We're primarily going to deal with him as a foreign policy president, so this is going to lean pretty heavily into Chapter 24, but we will deal with the last little bit of 23 and talk about his domestic administration, his domestic policies, especially during the first 2 years that he was in office. So Wilson was born in Virginia in 1856. He was born during the Civil War. He grew up in the South in the waning during the Civil War and Reconstruction before moving up to New England to go to school at Johns Hopkins University, where he got a PhD in political science. He would go on to be the president of Princeton University and a one-term governor of New Jersey from 1911 to 1913 before he is inaugurated as President of the United States. And we remember that the reason that Wilson, the Democrat, was able to win in the election of 1912 is essentially because the Republican Party had split between Teddy Roosevelt, who was running as a progressive, the Bull Moose Party, and William Howard Taft, who was running as the Republican. That split in the Republican Party had allowed Wilson to become only the second Democrat to win the White House since the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. Wilson is a progressive, but he's sort of a hypercharged progressive. He was somebody who, as an academic, had expressed real doubts about the American system of government. He wanted us to have more of a parliamentary system of government. He was impatient with the democratic debates that you would find in the House of Representatives, which he thought gave every state too much power to influence or derail legislation. Wilson, being a progressive, is somebody who really likes experts, and therefore he finds the political process messy, and he would prefer to put programs in the hands of scientists and experts to let them make the decisions and run things rather than let politicians do these things. And there is merit to that, and there is, of course, a lot to not like about that as well. But this impulse is going to be very much a part of Wilson's presidency. He whether he intends to do or not, is going to be concentrating a lot of power in the federal government and a lot of power in his own hands. And one of the among the programs that Wilson is going to carry out in his first 2 years in office is to push for financial reform and how the government funded itself. So right before he comes in, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified by the necessary number of states, and that authorized the Congress to impose a federal income tax. There had only been a federal income tax at one other point in American history. It had been instituted during the Civil War in 1863 to help pay for the war, and it had gone out of existence in 1872. So now it is going to come back. Courtesy of the 13th Amendment. And basically what Wilson is after here is kind of a traditional Southern goal. Southerners had always disliked tariffs. Remember, a tariff is merely a tax on goods imported into the country. Northern manufacturers liked tariffs because that kept foreign goods out, and therefore there was less competition. Southerners disliked tariffs because as an agricultural region, they had to buy manufactured goods produced elsewhere. And if you kept foreign competition out, that meant American manufacturers could charge more because there was less competition, and that hurt the South. Agriculture, of course, something that Southerners and Westerners would be very eager to point out does not always guarantee profit. You're at the mercy of weather, climate, infestations of insects, and these sorts of things. And the tariff had always been a hot-button issue in American politics. It had a couple of times taken the country to the very brink of civil war. And so as a Democrat, Wilson inherits this view of tariffs as a really bad way to fund the federal government. And up till Wilson becomes president, the tariff was the primary way that the United States government gained revenue for operation. Now that's going to change with the Revenue Act of 1913, which lowers the tariff and implements the income tax for the United States. And basically what you get here is a switch from the way that we're going to make money for the federal government. So the tariff rate goes down by 10%, and you impose a tax on personal income above $4,000. And what that means is that you're essentially going to be taxing about 3% of the American population. Those taxes will, of course, go up over time, especially once we get involved in World War I. You'll have a top tax rate that will go up to 77% for the wealthiest of all Americans to help pay for the war. But you were able to do that because of this new Revenue Act of 1913 and the 16th Amendment. In 1916, there would be another Revenue Act that would reinstate the federal estate tax and establish taxes on the production of war material. Of course, a lot of that was being made for the Allies in World War I. And the Revenue Act of 1916 would raise the top income tax rate to 15% on individuals and raise the corporate income tax rate from 1% to 2%. So this was a major sea change in how the federal government is going to fund itself. It puts into place the mechanism by which taxes can be generated on income of both individuals and corporations and estates. When you die, if you made enough money, the government gets to tax that. This was a good way to raise revenue, but of course there were a lot of people who didn't like it, a lot of people who objected to it, who objected to the change. The same thing would be true with the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which is something that Wilson is going to shepherd through the Congress as well. And so basically creating a central bank and regional banks. And the goal here was to make the money supply more flexible and to give the government the mechanism to respond to financial panics and crises by regulating the amount of money that's in circulation, which of course then impacts the rate of inflation or deflation as it may be. Once more, this was something that was controversial, but it was going to play an important role in helping to manage the economy during the First World War. As a progressive, Wilson, of course, was antitrust. He's going to push through the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which is basically going to build on the Sherman Antitrust Act, be a lot more explicit about the kind of practices, anti-competitive practices that the trust use. One of the things that Wilson is also going to see born with his support is the creation of a new federal agency, the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, if you prefer, that would have the ability and the authority to investigate antitrust violations and enforce antitrust law independent of the Justice Department. So this was a new regulatory agency that's not going to require going through the Justice Department and lawsuits and that kind of thing. This is going to, a new agency going to be able to act directly against those corporations, and this is the beginning of a growing bureaucratic state of specialists and experts that Wilson is in favor of. Wilson, therefore, kind of fulfills the goals of a progressive president. He does a lot of things that people are going to find helpful, find controversial. There's nothing the president doesn't do that makes everybody happy or makes everybody unhappy. But it was in foreign policy rather than domestic policy where Wilson is sort of building on the momentum of Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. It's in foreign policy where Wilson is going to make his most profound impact on the world in many ways. It is what we think of today when we think of Wilson, and it is really his legacy is foreign policy. When he was inaugurated in 1913, Wilson told a friend, quote, "It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs," unquote. Because Wilson had no experience in foreign policy. He was an academic. He'd been a one-term governor of New Jersey. Suddenly he's the president of the United States. And he has an academic's way of looking at the world. And so foreign policy with its deals and counter deals and its use of force, and it was really not Wilson's forte. And yet fate is going to have its way with Woodrow Wilson, and his presidency is going to eventually be completely consumed by foreign affairs. Now, as we might expect, as a Democrat and an academic, Wilson is going to come to foreign policy questions from a different angle than William Howard Taft or Teddy Roosevelt. So Wilson doesn't want anything to do with Teddy Roosevelt's gunboat diplomacy. He doesn't believe in a militaristic foreign policy. He doesn't like to rattle the American saber. He doesn't like Taft's dollar diplomacy any better. He doesn't want to bully other countries with American money and economic power. And so what Wilson is going to advocate is what he calls moral diplomacy. So Teddy Roosevelt gave you gunboat diplomacy. William Howard Taft gave you dollar diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson's going to give you moral diplomacy. That kind of makes sense. Wilson is the son of a Presbyterian minister. He had a very strict moral code. You could, I think, fairly call him a moralist. Somebody who kind of saw the world in blacks and whites, rights and wrongs, that sort of thing. He was extremely self-confident as an educated man, and he was often self-righteous and condescending. If you agreed with Woodrow Wilson, you were a smart fellow. If you disagreed with Woodrow Wilson, well, there was probably something that was wrong to you. He tended to lecture. He tended to talk down to people, and to some extent to the public as well. And although he names William Jennings Bryan, the three-time failed Democratic presidential candidate, as his Secretary of State, in fact, Bryan's going to make moral speeches. He's going to essentially carry on a kind of campaign for moral diplomacy, but Wilson is actually going to run his own foreign policy. The Secretary of State is not going to have a very big role in it. Moral diplomacy would be defined by Wilson as giving respect to other countries, to recognize their sovereignty, not to push them around with American money or with American dollars. Human rights and being a good neighbor. These sorts of things are what Wilson is going to advocate in terms of his foreign policy. And so he's going to also have a kind of a Pacific, in terms of peace-oriented, non-military thrust to his moral diplomacy, whose goals would be worldwide justice, worldwide peace, and the extension of democracy around the globe. And it's very hard to argue against things like worldwide justice, worldwide peace, and the extension of democracy around the world. It's another thing to believe the talk. It's one thing to say, hey, this is what we think should happen. This is what we would like to see happen. It's another thing to think that you can actually achieve those things. It's another thing to believe that everybody kind of agrees with you on what worldwide peace and worldwide justice would look like. It's another thing to expect that everybody would be willing to welcome democracy, Jeffersonian democracy, in the way that it was practiced in the United States or even in parts of Western Europe. But nonetheless, this was Wilson's goal, and you would see it manifested in serious attempts to try and make things like war impossible. Now, a lot of people believe that war had become outdated, that the world had become too interconnected, courtesy of the steamship and the telephone telephone and it allowed communication and faster travel, the interconnection of economies. It seemed like war would disrupt all of that. It would cost people too much money as well as be too destructive. War was probably a thing of the past anyway, but there were still hot spots around the globe. You still have the great empires competing for colonies in Africa and the Middle East, in Central Asia, and these sorts of things. All of the great empires had large armies and they had large navies, and they had general staffs that were constantly, fine-tuning their plans for possible war with their rivals and their neighbors, and so you could not write off war as a possibility completely, no matter what some people predicted in opinion columns and academic papers and these sorts of things. But Wilson's actually going to try and make war something that can't happen. So with his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, he helps to negotiate a series of what are called cooling off treaties with some 30 countries, including some very important, powerful ones, England, France, Italy. And these were negotiated between 1913 and 1914. And what these cooling off treaties basically do is to obligate the signatories to submit disputes between nation states to a permanent commission of investigation. So, two countries have a problem, they can't resolve it themselves, the kind of thing that might escalate to cause a war, and instead of going to war, they're going to hand it over to this permanent commission. Basically, our arbitration. It's an international body that's going to be the honest broker between the potentially warring parties, and the idea here is, of course, that then there will be investigations and gathering of data. This will all take a very long time. The leaders of both sides can say, hey, look, this is being resolved. Emotion and fear can be hopefully taken out of the process that might trigger a premature recourse to war or some sort of military confrontation. And while these investigations play themselves out, everybody will cool down. They'll cool off. The emotions will subside. People will think better of the possibility of avoiding war and say, wow, is this really worth fighting for? Is this worth the expense and blood and treasure? And Wilson's counting on the fact that the answer will probably be no. They won't think that at all. And so this is very idealistic. That we can actually negotiate amongst countries to get rid of war, and it had never been tried before, and so Wilson and Bryan and other diplomats are going to give it a shot. But of course, when push comes to shove, nation states look out for their own interests. There's an axiom that countries do not have permanent friends and they do not have permanent enemies. They have permanent interests, and alliances shift as those interests evolve and change. And countries are going to look out for themselves. They're going to take care to protect themselves and their colonies and their trade and these sorts of things. And so a piece of paper is not much of a guarantee when push comes to shove, as is evidenced by the fact that the last of these treaties is signed in 1914, and in August of that year, the entire world goes to war, and nobody paused for a moment to consider these cooling off treaties or submit anything to international boards of arbitration. But we begin to get an idea here of the kind of idealistic approach that Wilson is going to take in foreign policies. It was in Latin America, where the United States, of course, had been establishing its dominance for quite a while, that Wilson really seeks to remake American foreign policy, to focus on human rights and national integrity. So he's going to try and be a friend, a good neighbor. In 1914, he offered to pay Colombia's $25 million or to pay Colombia $25 million and give it preferential treatment in use of the Panama Canal as a way of expressing America's, quote, sincere regret for the way Teddy Roosevelt had orchestrated building the Panama Canal. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt had hinted to the Panamanians they should rise up in rebellion, and when they did, he recognized their new country immediately and threatened war against Colombia if they attacked it and forced the Colombians to back down. The Panamanians are the ones, therefore, that signed the treaty that allowed us to build the canal. And as far as Woodrow Wilson is concerned, this is horrible. The U.S. had interfered in the internal affairs of Colombia. It had bullied the Colombians. It had manipulated the system. It had threatened the use of military force. And so Roosevelt had done a horrible thing. And Wilson believes that the United States needs to make reparations for that. So we're going to give the Colombians $25 million. We're going to send them to the head of the line to use the Panama Canal. He wants Congress to vote a resolution of regret. That actually is not going to happen, but the money will be paid, and the preferential treatment in the use of the canal will be extended. And in this way, Wilson is trying to make amends. But think about it this way. One, had Teddy Roosevelt really done something wrong? And certainly the people on the losing side of that, Colombians, were not very happy with what he had done and the way that he had done it. The Panamanians, on the other hand, were delighted with what he had done. And so if the U.S. is going to apologize, it's saying not just to Colombia, hey, we regret the way that we did this. It's saying to the Panamanians, isn't it, we regret getting you your independence. And Wilson, of course, is completely ignoring the fact that Teddy Roosevelt was doing what was in the best interest of the United States, something that was going to benefit America militarily, but also benefit world trade. If he had not done that, there would have been no Panama Canal, at least not when the Panama Canal was built, and the world would have suffered for that. In both peacetime and wartime. And beyond that, notice that Wilson doesn't offer to give back the Panama Canal. If Wilson is saying, wow, we stole this territory from Colombia to give it to the Panamanians so we could build a canal, we're really sorry for that. Here's $25 million. But of course, Panama remains independent and we're keeping the canal and we're keeping our dominance in Latin America and all these kinds of things. How sincere an apology is that really? If somebody stole your car, and they drove it around for, a couple of years, 4 or 5 years. And then one day you got a letter from them saying, oh, hey, look, 5 years ago I stole your car. I found your address in the glove box the other day. And I've been feeling kind of guilty about stealing your car. And so I wanted to write a letter and apologize. And here's $1,000 to show you how sincere I am. Oh, by the way, though, I'm keeping the car. It's a nice ride, and I'm really enjoying it. Would you consider that to be an adequate apology? Would you consider that to be adequate recompense? And the answer is probably no. And isn't that sort of what Woodrow Wilson is doing here with the Panama Canal? One of the problems for Wilson, of course, in his conduct of foreign affairs and his conduct of his own moral diplomacy is the idea that the U.S. is going to hold itself to this very, very high standard. We're going to let our countries run their own business. We're not going to meddle militarily, diplomatically, economically. We're going to respect the decisions that you make and basically butt out. The difficulty with Wilson doing that is Wilson's a moralist. And basically what he's expecting is that, hey, this is the way we're going to behave. We're going to stop meddling. And once we stop meddling, what we expect all of you foreign countries to do is to look at the United States, to recognize the superiority of our system of government, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and emulate those things. So Wilson expects that once we stop bullying, as he would put it, other countries will view the United States very differently and want to emulate the United States. And of course, that's not going to happen. And Wilson is too moral, too moralistic, too paternalistic to be patient for change. And when that change doesn't happen quickly enough, it doesn't the leaders of foreign countries don't respond in the way that Wilson wants them to respond, Wilson has kind of a short fuse. And so he's going to wind up intervening in the affairs of Latin America more often than either of his two predecessors combined. He's going to send U.S. Marines into Haiti in 1915. He's going to send them into the Dominican Republic in 1916. He's going to maintain the presence of Marines in Nicaragua that had been instituted by William Howard Taft. But it is in Mexico where Wilson is going to get the United States most deeply involved. In fact, it's in Mexico where Wilson is going to take the United States to the very verge of war with a foreign power. And to understand where all this comes from, we have to step off to the side here and talk a little bit about Mexican history. So what happens is in 1911, the ruler of Mexico since 1874, Porfirio Diaz, is overthrown. He had come into office as a reformer, had been in office for a long time, had become corrupt, was lining his own pocket and that of his friends, and so there was a rebellion against him, and he was overthrown. At the time, U.S. businesses had investments worth over $1 billion in Mexico. Farms, mines, oil fields in particular. Standard Oil had a lot of property in Mexico, for example. And so anything that happens in Mexico is going to intensely interest American businessmen and American government. And of course, we share a very long common border, and that border was open. There was no restriction about crossing that border. There were all kinds of places where you could do it, and customs controls and were very few and very far between. So you have Diaz, who's overthrown. And his replacement is a liberal reformer by the name of Francisco Madero. And Madero is kind of a Mexican progressive. He's one of these people who wants to, better the life of the ordinary Mexican, extend rights, weaken the power of the hierarchies in Mexico, particularly the Catholic Church and the army, and the wealthy landowners who tended to call all the shots and run things for their own benefit or in their own interest. And so Madero was somebody that Wilson and American progressives liked, but he was not the kind of person who really had the skill set necessary to run a country, to run a government, to implement the changes that he had promised. And as a result, a political opposition grew up to Madero's efforts very quickly, and that led to a coup by a general by the name of Victoriano Huerta, who had Madero thrown in jail, and while he was in the custody of the Mexican government, Madero was murdered. And the suspicion, and probably the accurate suspicion, was that this is something that Huerta had orchestrated. So there had been two changes of government in Mexico, and in the way that it turned out was disappointing to American progressives. Huerta was not the progressive type. He was basically a military strongman, and it turns out he's going to be rather corrupt. But his government nonetheless was recognized by most of the nations of the world. What had happened in Mexico was not altogether uncommon in Mexico. It was not altogether uncommon in other places or around the globe. It might be nasty and ugly and unfortunate, but this is sometimes the way that governments changed, and Huerta had consolidated control and held the power in Mexico City, and so you were going to have to deal with them, and the nations of Europe, for example, recognized them. But President Wilson refused to do so. Wilson was disgusted by the overthrow of the reform-minded Madero, and so he publicly labeled Huerta a butcher and decided that it was in the interest of the United States and the interest of mankind to oust Huerta from power, to, as Wilson put it, quote, teach the South American republics to elect good men, unquote. Teach the South American republics to elect good men. Notice how quickly we've slipped away from the tenets of moral diplomacy, of letting other countries run their own affairs, respecting their sovereignty and their territorial integrity, not butting in either diplomatically, militarily, or economically. When Wilson sees something go wrong in Mexico that he doesn't like, that he thinks is wrong, that he thinks is swimming against what he would perceive to be the true course of history and of mankind, then he can't resist becoming involved. He can't resist coming involved. Of course, he's not going to plan an American invasion. He's not going to plan an American coup. What he's going to do is throw his support behind Mexican forces who are rebelling against the Huerta government. So this is the Mexican Civil War, which had been ongoing, now picks up steam. You have 4 armies who are fighting against the Huerta government, and 2 of these were sort of peasant-led kind of armies. One under a fellow named Zapata. The other was led by Francisco Pancho Villa, and then you had 2 sort of more conventional military forces under a general named Obregón and another by the name of Carranza. These 4 armies were cooperating with each other. There wasn't a single unified command or anything like that, but they're all trying to overthrow the Huerta government. And that means that the United States is willing to assist them, at least to assist them clandestinely with arms and munitions and money, and overtly with encouragement and diplomatic attacks on the Huerta government, and at the same time that we are going to send our own arms and munitions to support the anti-Huerta forces. Wilson is going to deploy the U.S. Navy off Mexico's ports in order to stop the flow of munitions from Europe to the Mexican government, and principally from Germany. The Germans were Huerta's friends, and they were selling them all sorts of weapons and ammunition. It was perfectly okay, Wilson believes, for the U.S. to intervene by giving arms and munitions to the people we like, but it was not okay for some foreign power, especially European power, to intervene to get arms and ammunition to the people that we didn't like in Mexico. And of course, the idea of American warships off the coast of Mexico enforcing what is in essence a blockade against certain types of commerce had no precedent in international law. It was more of a gunboat diplomacy kind of thing than a moral diplomacy kind of thing. But Wilson believed that the ends justified the means. And this is a trap that some progressives tended to fall into. If the goal was laudatory, if the goal was lofty enough, then you could do all sorts of unsavory things to get there because, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And Wilson sees no contradiction in this whatsoever. But the presence of American vessels off the coast of Mexico is going to lead to complication. Now, we're not the only Navy that's there. There are British and French and Italian and German ships there as well. And the reason that they're there is because all of these countries have investments in Mexico. They all have lots of their own nationals living in Mexico, and it is a responsibility of any government to protect its citizenry no matter where they are in the world. And it had been a traditional role of navies to hover near places where a lot of your nationals lived on foreign soil, to be close at hand. If those people were being threatened, you could move in to protect them, or if need be, to evacuate them. And in the era before airplane travel and rapid communication by radio and these sorts of things, you need to have somebody there on the spot who could respond to problems very, very quickly. And all of this is going to set up an incident that is going to embroil the United States into a deep trouble in Mexico. So one of the places we have a lot of American citizens and other foreign nationals is the port city of Tampico, which was adjacent to a very large oil field that was owned by Standard Oil. And obviously that oil is a very valuable commodity. Tampico was a strategic location, so the Huerta and anti-Huerta forces were fighting all around it, and the anti-Huerta forces were moving in on Tampico, and there was an expectation that there would be a very vicious battle there, probably pretty soon. So all of these foreign naval squadrons, including the American squadron, came into Tampico and evacuated their nationals onto the decks of their warships. Now, this is a very inconvenient arrangement. Warships are not meant to have lots of passengers. There's barely enough room for the crews. But the idea was that the civilians would stay on the warships until the fighting was over, and then they would be landed and allowed to go back to their homes and their businesses. Well, the battle that everybody thought was going to happen didn't happen. At least it didn't happen yet. And after a few days, you had to send all these foreign nationals back ashore, but the tensions were still high, and it looked like it might only be another few days or a few weeks at best before the battle would begin and these nationals would have to be evacuated. And one of the difficulties here is that moving civilians from shore to ship and then from ship to shore had used up most of the gasoline on these warships to run the engines that powered their small boats. And so if you were going to have to reenact this evacuation, you were going to need more fuel, and it was going to take quite a while for that fuel to get to the squadron from the United States. And so when the commander of the U.S. squadron off Tampico was told by one of the consular officials in the city that there was a stockpile of gasoline in a warehouse in town, the Americans arranged to buy it. They sent a small boat with 7 American sailors to go pick it up. So they were kind of coming up a canal, going toward this warehouse, which unfortunately was situated near a strategic bridge that the Huerta forces were guarding against a potential attack by the anti-Huerta forces. And when the American sailors came up in their boat, wearing their uniforms, flying an American flag, they got too close to that bridge for the local Huerta commander, and he stopped them and he arrested them. Didn't really care about their story. He arrested them and put them under guard. Now, word of this went up the chain of command very quickly. The general in charge of the Huerta army had the Americans released, so they were under arrest for a handful of hours. They were allowed to get the gasoline. They went back to their ship. And of course, this is an incident, right? A nation's vessels enjoy the right of extraterritoriality, which means that if you're standing on the deck of an American ship, no matter where it is in the world, or you're standing on the ground of an American embassy anywhere in the world, you are standing on American soil, just as though you are standing here in Austin, Texas. And a foreign government, a foreign military force can no more step onto the deck of that ship and arrest you than it could show up at your home and arrest you here in the middle of Texas. So American rights had been violated here. This was a diplomatic no-no. The American Naval Squadron commander objected. He sent a formal, request to know what had happened, and the Huerta official explained it. It was all a mistake. A lower-level officer had acted inappropriately. Apologies made, and for the American naval commander, good enough. These sorts of things happen. The world is a messy place. It was obvious that no harm was really done. A proper apology had been made, and the incident was over, except that it wasn't over. The commander had to report what had happened to the Navy Department. The Navy Department had to report to the president, and the president was outraged by this. He didn't care what happened to Standard Oil or even Standard Oil's employees. And he was very blunt about saying that the United States is not going to get involved in Mexico's war and Mexico's affair to protect the interest of John D. Rockefeller, but America's honor was a different thing, and America's honor had been insulted. And so the apology of the local commander was not going to be enough. Wilson wanted an apology from the Huerta government. Of course, what Wilson was seeing here was an opportunity to turn up the heat on Huerta, who was not doing well in the Mexican Civil War. This would, add pressure to him that would hopefully force him to abdicate and flee, abandon office, that sort of thing. And so what Wilson does is he sends word to the Huerta government and demands a formal apology, which must include the hoisting of a giant American flag over the forts of Mexico's principal port, the port of Veracruz, and the firing of a salute to the Stars and Stripes. And what Wilson's counting on here is that if Huerta does that, it will be so humiliating that he will lose face before his citizenry, who will see him as weak, and that will help drive him from power. Huerta, on the other hand, saw things differently. Here was a chance to stand up to the United States and to prove that he wasn't going to be pushed around. So although there was an apology, this hoisting of a flag and firing of salute, that was not going to happen. And Wilson said, okay, that's not good enough. American honor has been insulted, and American honor is going to be upheld. And so he ordered the Navy and the Army to seize and hold Veracruz. And so in April of 1914, 1,000 sailors and Marines, backed up by American warships, stormed ashore at Veracruz. They would be followed quickly thereafter by 3,000 troops from the U.S. Army. Huerta, seeing this coming at the last moment, didn't want to make things worse, and he ordered his army to pull away from the city. But the word didn't get to everybody, and some local militia units were still there, and when the Americans came ashore, they fought, and so there was a battle. The Americans won that fairly easily, but it was still expensive, with 19 Americans dead, 71 others wounded. Mexican casualties, of course, were much heavier, and the United States has just seized Mexico's principal port, and we control it, and we're not going to let it go until Huerta is driven from office. And so the U.S. has militarily intervened. This is an intervention far larger and more significant, more dangerous than anything Teddy Roosevelt had ever done under gunboat diplomacy, right? And so this is something that could very quickly escalate to all-out war, and it certainly looked like it would. Fortunately, it doesn't. Wilson has no real interest in a war. Huerta, of course, has no interest in a war whatsoever. And the rest of Latin America doesn't like this. South America doesn't like this. The Americans get used to doing this sort of thing. Who knows when they're going to stop? And so the governments of Argentina and Venezuela and Brazil and Chile offered to mediate. Wilson was very happy to take them up on that offer because here was an exit. He had expected the Huerta government to fold very quickly, and it did not, and the U.S. troops were having to hang around in Veracruz, far longer than Wilson had expected. April, May, June go by, and they're still there and beginning to get nervous when they might be able to get out. So this offer of mediation was easily accepted by Wilson. Huerta, who was losing the war and being squeezed from all sides, saw this as a way out too. And eventually it sort of had a happy ending. In July of 1914, Huerta resigned from office. He and his friends get on a German warship and go to Europe. They loot the treasury and take most of Mexico's wealth with them. But he's gone. He's gone. And so if Wilson's policy had been to support the forces fighting against Huerta, to apply pressure on Huerta to get him out of office, that had, Wilson could claim, that had worked, and at relatively small cost in blood, although with a very heavy-handed military intervention. And so the four armies They've been fighting were to now converge on Mexico City, and the four leaders of those armies agree to rotate the presidency among them, and the first guy who's going to take over is Carranza. And so Wilson believes, okay, this problem is solved. Wilson recognizes the Carranza government, and Carranza sort of looks like a politician. He's got a very eloquent, white beard and mustache, the elderly guy with a little bit of a gut, and, he dresses very nicely. He seems like the kind of person who ought to be running the country, and so Wilson hopes that he can deal with Carranza and everything will be fine. Well, of course, it wasn't fine because Carranza, having come into power, is going to very quickly have a falling out with Zapata and Pancho Villa, who are going to turn against him. Obregón is going to support him. The Mexican War is going to start up again, and Carranza, of course, wants the Americans to leave immediately, and he makes it very clear that as soon as they leave, the Mexican officials are going to arrest any citizen of Veracruz who had cooperated with the Americans. And most of the citizens of Veracruz had cooperated with the Americans. They had taken jobs for the Americans. They had dealt with the Americans. When the Americans were there, they began sanitation and vaccination programs that had really, dropped the incidence of disease, reduced the amount of malaria and yellow fever, had drastically shrank infant mortality. The U.S. occupation of Veracruz, from a standpoint of equal application of the law, equal application of taxes, no corruption, public health, had been sort of a boon for the people of Veracruz. And the United States had been there now for quite some time, and Wilson was not going to pull out and leave the Mexicans who had cooperated with American military forces to the tender mercies of the Carranza government. So there was sort of a standoff. And it went on for many more months until Carranza began to lose the war that Pancho Villa and Zapata had started against him. They were about to capture Mexico City, and Carranza needed a place to flee, and Veracruz was the logical place. And so at the last minute, he sort of changed his mind, said, we're not going to punish anybody for cooperating with the Americans. And Wilson said, thank God we're leaving. And the U.S. pulled out, and Carranza was able to go to Veracruz and to, rebuild his forces and continue the war against Zapata and Pancho Villa. But the U.S. had managed to extract itself honorably, and none of the Mexicans who had collaborated with the United States were, in fact, punished by Mexican authorities. And so Wilson could point to all this and say, hey, look, I accomplished the goal, maybe not in exactly the way I wanted to, certainly not, although he would not have admitted this, following the tenets of moral diplomacy, but I have gotten rid of Huerta, and we have what the United States government considers to be an acceptable ruler now in Mexico. And although we had walked right up to the edge of war with the Mexican government, we had managed to avoid it. And for Wilson, that's a good thing, because no sooner does this mess in Mexico begin to resolve itself than the First World War breaks out in Europe. Now, the reasons for World War I are complex. They are a couple of generations in the making. We do not have time to go into all of that. Fascinating story that it is. But sort of to suffice it to say, that it was the collapse of the European balance of power, or what was perceived to be threats to the European balance of power, that had lasted since the end of Napoleon in 1815 and had produced more or less a general peace in Europe since then, that is going to bring about the war. And basically what had happened was that in the late 1860s and 1870, the Prussians had waged a series of wars against Austria and France to bring all the German-speaking peoples of Central Europe under a single government, and that government would be the German Empire. Germany, up till 1870, was not a country. Germany was a geographic phrase. People said Germany the way we say New England, or the way we say the Southwest, or something like that. The Austrians and the Germans, of course, speak the same language. They have very much the same culture, and the leader of Germany at the time, Kaiser Wilhelm, and his Secretary of State, Otto von Bismarck, were a very good diplomatic military team. And so basically, they fought a very short war with the Austrians, beat them decisively, and forced the Austrian government to hand over the German-speaking provinces that they controlled. And at that point, there were only 2 German-speaking provinces that had not yet become part of Germany, and that was Alsace and Lorraine on the east bank. The west bank of the Rhine River, and those were controlled by France. And the French and the Germans, of course, speak different languages. Their cultures are very different, and in 1870, the Prussians and the French went to war. This is the Franco-Prussian War. France, at that point in time, was considered to be the greatest military power in Europe. It was still living on the ancient glories of Napoleon, but the Prussian army was much better. It was better led, and the French were beaten pretty badly. It took more than a year for that to happen. It involved the capture of the French king, Napoleon III, the siege of Paris, but the French were ultimately forced to surrender. And as part of the surrender, they lost colonies to the Germans. They had to pay an enormous war reparation, and they had to give up the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. And whereas the Kaiser and Bismarck had very quickly made amends with the culturally, linguistically, similar Austrians, so bygones were allowed to be bygones, that's not going to happen with the French. The French are permanently embittered. They're determined that they're going to have their revenge, and they're willing to plot it for a very long time. And the Germans know that. And so France and Germany are aware from 1871 on that sooner or later they're going to fight. They're going to fight each other. And this comes at a time when the Second Industrial Revolution has made the mass production of everything cheaper and easier, the mass transportation of everything cheaper, faster, easier. You need fewer and fewer people to be involved in agriculture, handfuls of people, relatively speaking, with modern machinery and scientific method can grow enough food to feed entire populations, where it used to take most of the entire population to grow the food to do that. And so it becomes possible for the first time in human history to maintain giant standing armies in peacetime. Heretofore, standing armies, regular armies, had been relatively small. When you got into war, you had to mobilize, and that would take time, and it would be many months before the fighting could really get going. But now you can keep armies numbering in the millions of men on hand constantly. You can mass produce the uniforms, the weapons, the vehicles, the munitions, the food that they need. And that means that it's much easier to start military operations if a war were to break out and it's much faster to do it than ever had been before. And so if you see your potential enemy building up a giant army, you build up a giant army. If he builds up a giant fleet, you build up a giant fleet. If he's laying plans to attack you, you lay plans to attack him. And here the memories of what had happened in the Austro-Prussian, the Franco-Prussian War, become very important because those wars had been won by the Prussians in some part because they were the first to mobilize. They mobilized first, they mobilized fastest, they were able to go on to the offensive, the war was fought on the enemy's territory, and the enemy had won. And so what everybody expects will happen in the future inevitable war between the Germans and the French is the same sort of thing. Whoever mobilizes fastest undertakes the offensive. The war will be fought on the other guy's soil and getting the first blow in, mobilizing and going on to the attack before the other guy is probably going to lead to victory. So mobilization becomes all important. How fast can you do it? And that relies on the railroads, how quickly you can assemble the troops and pair them with their equipment, move them to the front, and gather them together to begin military operations. In Germany, the railroads were built to facilitate military needs. In France, they had been built for economic purposes, which means that Germany can mobilize far faster than France. The Germans had become one of the leading industrial powers of Europe, and the rise of Germany, which had not been around as a country in 1815 when the Napoleonic Wars came to an end, had upset everything. And so the French were looking to find an advantage over the Germans for the inevitable war when it happened. And what that basically wound up meaning is they went and they made treaties with Russia and with England, who would, if Germany attacked France, would come into the war on the side of the French. The Germans made their alliances with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and basically what you had done in the 1870s was you had taken the Austrian and Hungarian empires and you put them together under a single throne, and then given them the Balkans, which had been a source of discontent and argument amongst the great European powers for centuries. And basically it's like, hey, you know what, we're going to solve the problem of the Balkans by giving them to the Austro-Hungarians, who will watch the eggs in that basket. The difficulty, of course, was that Austria-Hungary was not a natural country. It had too many languages, too many religions, peoples who had ancient grievances against each other, fought each other before, and the only way that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was really going to work was if no real stress was put on it, and if it could play one group of people off against the other, Hungarians against the Czechs and the Chets, and the Slovenes against the Serbs, and these sorts of things. And so it was a precarious kind of an institution. And this was the ally that the Germans had. And so what happens is you get imposed over Europe a web of entangling alliances, and that obligate countries to take actions on behalf of other countries if a threat or a potential threat begins to arise. And that's a system of things combined with, this arming to the teeth in preparation to defend yourself if you're attacked, that makes things more unstable, not stable, makes everybody nervous instead of reassures everybody, and creates a situation where a relatively minor event could ignite a very large war. And that minor event is going to come out of the Balkans. One of the provinces in the Balkans was Serbia. Serbia did not want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Serbia had a friend, and that friend was the Russian Empire, because the Serbs and the Russians are culturally alike, linguistically alike, and so they had a powerful patron. Serbia had fought a small war and won its independence from the Austro-Hungarians, but Serbia was not happy with the territory that it got. It wanted more territory that it thought belonged rightfully to it, specifically the provinces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, territory that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not inclined to give the Serbs. The Russians, of course, had a cultural affinity for the Serbs, but they also backed the Serbs because if the Serbs were ever to get Bosnia and Herzegovina, they would have a port on the Adriatic Sea, which is right where the western, or rather the eastern side of the Italian boot, and the Serbs would let their good friends the Russians use that, which would give the Russians a warm water port for their navy, and that was important to the Russians because half the year their navy's iced in, and it can't get out to sea in the event of a war. So the Russians have their own ulterior motives here. Ulterior motives are sort of something that we could say about everybody in all of this. And so we have the Serbs who are backed by the Russians, and the Serbs are in a confrontation with the Austro-Hungarians over Bosnia-Herzegovina. and the Serbs are agitating their Serbian terrorists who are launching attacks into Austro-Hungarian territory, which is very irritating, of course, to Franz Joseph, who is the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. It's a very delicate situation and one fraught with peril. And into this situation goes Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie. The Archduke is the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and he goes into Bosnia-Herzegovina on a tour of inspection. That includes a stop in the capital of Sarajevo, and as he and his wife are driving in an open car, kind of a convertible, through the streets of the town, a 19-year-old Serbian patriot, if you believe the Serbs, a terrorist, if you believe the Austro-Hungarians, shoots and kills both of them. And he's caught immediately, and the Austro-Hungarians find out that he's carrying a gun that could be traced back to the Serbian government, and some of his co-conspirators were trained by the Serbs. And so basically, again, we're grossly simplifying things here to just move ourselves down the road. A Serbian terrorist with ties to the Serbian government, at least as far as the Austro-Hungarians were concerned, has just killed the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was furious. People wanted retribution. There were demands that were placed on the Serbs that were onerous and humiliating. The Serbs were willing to accept almost all of them, but couldn't quite swallow the whole package, which is what the Austro-Hungarians intended. They saw this now as the opportunity to deal with the Serbian problem once and for all by crushing Serbia. But of course, an attack by the Austro-Hungarians on the Serbs would bring Russia to their defense. And so the Germans had an agreement with the Austro-Hungarians that they would fight Russia if Russia threatened Austria-Hungary. But of course, if the Germans are going to fight the Russians, that's going to trigger Russia's alliance with the French. And so one step leads to another, leads to another. And everybody is having to prepare for war, even as the diplomats are trying to avoid war. And of course, diplomacy is still being carried out old-fashioned ways by telegrams. None of the heads of states of these countries, the kings, the queens, the czars, they're all related to each other. They're cousins and nephews and that sort of thing. None of them want war. This is one of the things that's so mystifying about why World War I happens, is nobody really wanted it. The Serbs had agitated the Austro-Hungarians to the point to where there was going to be retribution. The Austro-Hungarians were determined to smash the Serbs. That was going to trigger all of these alliances, and the possibility that there might be war meant that countries had to begin mobilizing. And once you push the button to begin mobilizing, then the railway timetables take over, and they can't be stopped. They can't be reversed. It's a very intricate machine, and once it's put into motion, it cannot be stopped. And of course, what everybody would tell you is they were mobilizing to defend their borders, but an army that masses on a border could change its mind very quickly and decide to become an aggressor, not just a defender. And so when one set of countries begins to mobilize, the other set of countries begins to mobilize, and at some point, the machinery of war just takes over. And the Germans say, look, we've always known we were going to have a two-front war with the French and the British on one side and the Russians on the other. We have very detailed plans on how to fight that war, and the only way that we can win it is to act quickly and aggressively, and if we delay and we let the other guys mobilize, then our plans are going to be for nothing, and there's no way that we can win. And so basically, the momentum here just became too much, and finally all of these countries actually go to war against each other. And in the beginning, the Germans did very well. They came sweeping through Belgium instead of attacking across the French-German border in Alsace-Lorraine. This kind of catches the French by a surprise. The Belgians are basically overrun. The English come in, but the Germans almost capture Paris before a combined British-French counterattack stopped them at the end of their tracks. So for the first 5-6 months of the war, it's the kind of war that everybody expected. Armies wheeling and maneuvering against each other and having big battles and then, maneuvering and wheeling across the countryside again. But after 5-6 months of this, everybody's exhausted. Casualties have been massive, and the Germans are forced to back up away from Paris, but they only back up far enough to find good defensible ground, and here they begin to dig in. They begin to dig trenches. Now, trench warfare is as old as human history itself, but the scale of this trench warfare and the nature of it is going to be different than anything that anybody had ever seen before. And basically, both armies start to dig in, and eventually going to have an unbroken 500-mile-long trench line between the North Sea and the Swiss border. And so one of the things that had always been an axiom of warfare is that you can maneuver to try and get around an enemy's flank and attack his supply lines and get behind him and that sort of. That was no longer possible. There was no flank to get around. And what, of course, is also different about this trench warfare as opposed to other trench warfare like you'd seen in the Russo-Japanese War, the American Civil War, or something like that, is that the weapons that are being used are different than in previous conflict, because now you've perfected the machine gun. And a handful of guys using a machine gun can fire 600 rounds in a minute. They have the firepower that it used to take hundreds of men to wield, and you have steel-tubed, long-range artillery. You have very high explosives. You have barbed wire that you can put in front of these trenches to impede an attack against them, and you're using rapid-fire, bolt-action rifles. The airplane, which had only been invented in 1903, quickly becomes an implement of war. To bomb and to strafe. You have barrage balloons that can float up behind the front that are connected to field phones that can direct artillery fire. In other words, you have vastly increased the killing power of armies as well as navies. You've created air forces, and with barbed wire and trenches, it becomes impossible to maneuver. Every attack has to be a frontal attack, and attacking across the space between the rival trench lines, a space that is known as no man's land because neither side actually controlled it, is an extremely bloody proposition. And so World War I battles are meat grinders. They last for weeks, sometimes months at a time. You have to build up massive reserves of men and material if you're going to punch through one of these trench lines. Bombardments that last for days or weeks to try and weaken the enemy front, and then you send your men over the top. They climb out of their trenches and they try and cross no man's land through that barbed wire, which they had hoped their artillery would obliterate, but it never could really get the job done. And then they would be hit with enemy artillery, enemy rifle fire, but most of all enemy machine guns, and the slaughter would be simply horrific. It's sort of epitomized by a single day in 1916, July 1st, 1916, when the British launched an offensive near the Belgian border at a place called the Somme. And on that one day of combat, the English army suffered 60,000 casualties. One day of fighting, 60,000 casualties, of whom 20,000 men were killed outright. And that's just the English. We're not talking about the casualties the Germans suffered and the French suffered in that kind of fight. Battles that could kill and wound 250,000 men on both sides and barely move the trench line a mile or two in either direction. And in order to try and break this trench stalemate, all sorts of new weapons were now employed. The flamethrower was invented, and poison gas was used in battle for the first time. And eventually, you're going to see the invention of the tank as a way to try and defeat the trenches. And at sea, the submarine is going to come into its own, and that is going to have a giant impact on affairs of nations, and particularly with the United States. So here is this vast war that's erupted in Europe. It's going to suck in, England, France. Eventually, Italy comes into the war on the side of the Allied powers. The English, the French, the Italians, the Russians, the Serbs, the Belgians are your big Allied powers. And of course, if you get the English and the French in, then you get their colonies too. So Australia and Canada, New Zealand, South Africa are all on this thing on the side of the British, as are places like French Morocco and French Indochina, better known today as Vietnam. They're into the war as well. And there's going to be fighting that is going to spread through the Middle East. It's going to spread into Africa. It's going to go to all the world's oceans. The quick war of maneuver that everybody thought they were going to get has instead become this grinding, bloody thing that seems perpetually stalemated. And for the United States, this was a horrific thing to see happen. And clearly, it's not our war. Americans don't want to fight it. They don't want to become involved in it. But the government of Wilson has to have an approach to it. It has to have a policy to this war. And basically, Wilson had three options. He had three options, three things he could do. The first option was the one advocated by progressive purists who hated the idea of war, seeing in it the antithesis of everything that progressivism stood for. So they favored ignoring the war, a definite stance of neutrality. Let us have nothing to do with any of the warring parties. Let's don't sell them things. Let's don't make them things. Let's don't loan them money. Let's sort of quarantine the United States from the madness that is engulfing Europe and spreading throughout the rest of the world. The second option was, I guess you could call the pragmatic option, was to carry on business as usual. Okay, there's a war in Europe. Wars are expensive. They're going to need to borrow money. We can lend it to them at astronomical interest rates. They're going to need food and oil and coal and cotton and other things, and we can sell them all of that at inflated prices. They're going to need American industry to build them uniforms and weapons and rifles and make ammunition for them. We can do all that. We can sell it for them at a huge profit. In other words, let's trade with both sides. One side's as crazy as the other in all of this. There's not a good guy, there's not a bad guy, as far as Americans could see, despite the heavy-handed way that the Germans had treated the Belgian population, which included destruction of monuments and libraries, the assassination of leaders, the slaughter of women and children, where they believed that local Belgians had committed acts of sabotage. So the Germans had been very heavy-handed going into Belgium. The British and French propagandists had picked up on that. They had inflated it. They had aggrandized it. But nonetheless, there was enough there that was truthful for the Germans to be seen as rather frightful in all of this business. But nonetheless, war is war, war is ugly, war is messy, and war is something you can get rich from. So let's follow Thomas Jefferson's old advice that, quote, the new world should fatten on the follies of the old. The new world should fatten on the follies of the old. And then there was a third option, and this was the option favored by men like Teddy Roosevelt, and you can probably expect, where that was going. He did see good guys and bad guys. The Allies were the good guys. These were, the more democratic powers. These were the powers that the U.S. had the closest relationships to. They were the good guys, and we should support the good guys with money, resources, supplies, armaments, everything but men. Even Teddy Roosevelt is saying, don't go fight this war, but we know who the good guys are, and they should get our support. And the bad guys, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and eventually the Ottoman Turks and the Bulgarians, who will be known as the Central Powers, we should have nothing to do with. So those are Wilson's options. Ignore the war completely, have nothing to do with everybody that's fighting it. Or option number two, fatten off the follies of the old world, do business with both sides as they slaughter each other and make money off both sides. Or Teddy Roosevelt, there's good guys and bad guys, support the Allies and ostracize the Central Powers. What did Wilson do? Well, what Wilson opted for was sort of all three. He officially declared American neutrality, but he tempered that by trying to have the U.S. Carry on trade as usual. And basically trying to do business with both sides. But having done that, he allowed allied merchants and allied governments to monopolize that trade. And of course, this was very easy to do because the British declared a blockade of Germany. It became harder and harder to send anything into Germany, whereas getting things to France and England was relatively simple, although, as we shall see, not entirely safe. So Wilson's kind of, trying to straddle the fence here. He's also cognizant of the fact that you've had, something like 14 million immigrants come into the United States in the last decade of the 19th, the first decade of the 20th century, and they've come from all over Europe. So you've had people who come here from Germany as well as England, and from France as well as Austria-Hungary, and from Italy and Russia and these sorts of places. And so, you're not really sure where American public sentiment is with all of this. And so Wilson is trying to drive a very fine line here. But as the war goes on and it becomes more difficult for the European powers, they turn to try and hurt each other every way that they can, which of course includes economic warfare. And since the British and the French were buying a lot of war material that was being made in American factories, that means shipping across the Atlantic Ocean becomes vital to the Allied ability to carry on the war. And if the Germans are suffering under a British blockade, a surface blockade, surface ships, sitting out there in the North Sea to keep the German ports from sending ships out or bringing ships in, then the Germans want to implement a blockade of their own. And since they cannot do that with their surface fleet, they're going to have to do that with a new weapon, and that weapon is the submarine. Now, the first successful submarine that ever sank an enemy warship was built by the Confederacy during the American Civil War, but the Industrial Revolution has made it possible now to build real submarines. The diesel engine allows these submarines to sail very far out to sea, to stay there for long periods of time. They have torpedoes that they can fire either while they're surfaced or they're submerged. These submarines have a very low silhouette, so they are hard to see. Radar has not shown up yet. And so this is still stuff being done by lookouts. And the Germans are going to send their submarines to blockade England and Ireland. They declare a war zone 100 miles deep around England and Ireland, and basically say anything that comes into that war zone flying an Allied flag, we are going to sink. We are going to destroy without warning. This is what is known as unrestricted submarine warfare. And submarines have to fight very differently than warships. They're basically engaged in what is known as commerce raiding. And commerce raiding is as old a tactic as there is in naval warfare. And basically, it's a guerrilla war on the high seas. You send your ships out there to disrupt the enemy's maritime supply lines, to stop the flow of goods across an ocean. And the way that you did that when there were only surface ships and there was no airplane, there was no radio or anything like that, is you sailed around, you look for enemy merchant ships. You didn't want to mess with enemy warships if you could, and you would stop them, you would board them, you would search them, you would find out who they belonged to, what they were carrying, where they were going to, and then you would either take them as a prize of war, which means you force them to come with you to a friendly port where the passenger crew would be put ashore, the ship and its cargo would be sold off at auction, to the benefit of the warring government, or if you weren't able to do that on the high seas, then you would take passenger and crew onto your ship. Your surface ship should have plenty of room to do that, and then you would sink or burn the enemy commerce vessel. Submarine can't do that. Submarines are very, very small. They have a crew of like 40 men. They're crammed full of supplies and equipment. There's not even enough room for the entire crew to sleep at the same time. There's only enough beds for half of them. So half of the crew's on duty, half of the crew's sacked out, and they do what's called hot bunking, which means when shift change comes, the one guy gets out of the bed and goes to work, and the other guy who's just coming off work goes and lays in the bed, which of course is still warm from the body that had just been there. And so the one thing a submarine cannot do is take on the passenger and crew of an enemy merchant vessel. Submarines are relatively slow, 3 or 4 knots below the surface, maybe 7 or 8 on the surface, and merchant ships are much faster. So if you try and chase a merchant ship on the surface, that merchant ship is apt to get away. The merchant ship also has a radio, so it can send an SOS, and suddenly an enemy warship or an enemy airplane might show up to attack a surface submarine. And a submarine is very lightly armored. It's incredibly vulnerable if it's attacked on the surface by a destroyer or an enemy submarine dropping, or an enemy airplane dropping bombs or something like that. And so the only safe way for a submarine to fight is submerged, to attack without warning, or to attack by night on the surface when its low silhouette makes it very hard to see. You don't have the ability to stop these enemy ships. You don't have the time necessary to board and to search them. You have no ability to take off their passenger and crew, which means you must strike without warning. And although this is the way everybody's submarines are going to fight in World War II and beyond, that was a new thing in World War I, and it broke all sorts of rules about the way commerce raiding was conducted on the high seas. And it meant that civilian passengers on ships were being killed or wounded, women and children sometimes. There was a frightfulness to this that had never existed before, and although this made military sense, it did not dissuade people like Wilson from accusing the Germans of breaking the rules, of wantonly killing civilians and innocent women and children, and violating the laws of war. And so submarine warfare is new. It's going to play a huge role in what's going to unfold. It's going to be the problem that is going to bring the United States into war in Europe. And we are going to stop there so that we don't have an extra long lecture. So what we're going to do, this is World War I, Part 1. There'll be World War I, Part 2, and that will be the last lecture for our second test. So I kind of hope that we would get to chapter 25 and deal with the 20s. We're not going to for this next test. So the end of World War I will be the end of the material that we cover on test 2, which means that I've got 5 questions for you. I'm going to ask you 2 of them for this lecture, and then there will be 3 on the next lecture where we finish up this section of the course. Okay, so lecture number, or question, the first question from this lecture is, what was the name of Wilson's foreign policy? What's the name given to Wilson's foreign policy? So Teddy Roosevelt had gunboat diplomacy, William Howard Taft has dollar diplomacy. What kind of diplomacy does Woodrow Wilson have? In question number 2 here, in April of 1914, Woodrow Wilson ordered American troops to seize what city in Mexico? In April of 1914, Woodrow Wilson ordered American troops to seize what city in Mexico? So 2 questions from this lecture. The next lecture, which will be posted tomorrow, we'll have 3 questions, which will finish up the questions, and the essay is going to go out along with this lecture, so that you'll have those. World War I, Part 1 is now behind us. We have 1 more lecture to get the U.S. involved in World War I and play that story out. That will be our next lecture and our final lecture for this test. So keep an eye out for that. Remember, if you have questions, you're uncertain about the assignment, that sort of thing, get a hold of me. Remember, I'm always willing to look at draft thesis paragraphs. give you feedback on that, look at draft outlines so that we can make sure that you get off on the right foot for your essay, you're covering the necessary ground, you're looking at both sides, you're taking that objective, analytical approach to the essays that I want you to take. And so the email is always there, and I am always willing and ready to help you. So we are on the verge of getting the U.S. involved in World War I. When we get together next time, we will take the plunge and we will go with the American Expeditionary Force over there and see how the U.S. contributes to Allied victory and how Woodrow Wilson contributes to making the peace that is supposed to end all wars, but instead basically cues up, in many ways, a second World War.